The courtroom was eerily quiet as 8-year-old Emma stood at the witness stand, clutching her teddy bear tightly. Her small fingers gripped the worn fabric as though it were the only thing holding her together. The weight of her next words was so heavy, it felt like her tiny frame might collapse under it. Her eyes flickered across the sea of faces in the room, but she couldn't bring herself to meet anyone's gaze, especially not her parents. She couldn't look at them now, not after what she was about to say. The judge, an older man with silver hair and a face that bore the weight of countless trials, peered over his glasses at her. His sharp, authoritative gaze softened, just for a moment. He had seen many cases in his years on the bench, but there was something about Emma that made him pause, his heart aching with the heaviness in her words. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "Emma," he began, his tone calm but filled with quiet expectation. "Can you tell us what happened to your sister?" Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she tried to steady herself. Her small body trembled beneath her oversized clothes. She had never imagined standing here in front of so many strangers, with all eyes fixed on her. She could feel the weight of it, every gaze, every breath of the audience, all waiting, all judging. She couldn't do it. She couldn't say the words. Her chest felt tight, like there was no air left to breathe. But then she took a deep breath, trying to find strength. She spoke, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "It was my fault," Emma muttered, her words barely cutting through the thick silence in the room. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted her to stop crying." The room seemed to hold its breath. Emma could feel her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating her, leaving her exposed in front of everyone. The gasps that followed were sharp and sudden, and Emma instinctively shrank back. She could feel the weight of their stares. She could almost hear their thoughts. How could a little girl like her be capable of this? The judge, a man who had presided over countless cases of all kinds, had his face twisted in disbelief. He had seen children who were nervous, confused, or frightened, but he had never seen one quite like Emma. She was too small for the burden she carried. He straightened up in his chair, clearing his throat to mask the tremor in his voice. "Emma," he said, softening, "can you tell us what happened to your sister?" Emma's hands shook as she gripped her teddy bear harder. The familiar fabric did little to calm the storm raging inside her. She felt a dizzying rush of guilt and fear, her body betraying her mind desperately wanting to turn back time. She could hear her parents, her mother in particular, weeping uncontrollably in the front row. Emma couldn't bear to look at them, especially not at her mother. The pain in her eyes would haunt her forever. She was the cause of it. She had brought them here. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Emma stammered, her voice cracking. "But I did." A collective gasp echoed throughout the courtroom. Sarah, her mother, let out a strangled sob, covering her face in her hands. The sound of her grief pierced the silence like a knife. Emma's heart wrenched, and she felt a hot tear escape down her cheek. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She didn't understand it. How could she? She was just a little girl. Her father, Mike, stood motionless, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and horror. He was trying to stay strong, trying to be the rock he always promised his family he would be. But Emma could see his weakness now. His resolve was faltering, his own emotions threatening to spill over. She had never seen him like this before, never seen him look at her like this. The prosecutor, who had been calm and poised only moments ago, now appeared lost for words. He was pacing in front of the courtroom, his eyes darting between the defense, the jury, and Emma. His voice wavered as he tried to regain his composure, but the child's confession had thrown him off guard. He had prepared for every possible scenario, but this was something else entirely. "I didn't mean it," Emma whispered again, her voice breaking. She wanted to take it back. She wanted to unsay the words, to make everything go back to the way it had been before. But it was too late. The truth had been spoken, and it couldn't be unsaid. It was out there now. The judge, struggling to maintain his usual authority, leaned forward, his face tense. "Emma," he said carefully, "can you tell us exactly what happened that night?" Emma opened her mouth to speak, but before she could find the words, something inside her gave way. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the floor. The room swirled around her, the voices growing muffled and distant. She couldn't stay awake. She couldn't handle it anymore. The world went black. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. People jumped to their feet, shouting for medical assistance. A paramedic rushed forward, kneeling beside Emma's small, motionless body. Her parents were on their feet in an instant, panic-stricken. Sarah's sobs were now louder than before, mixed with frantic pleas to Emma to wake up. Emma's father, Mike, shook his daughter gently, his breath ragged as he tried to rouse her. "Emma," Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. "Sweetheart, please wake up, please." The paramedic quickly checked Emma's pulse. "She's fainted," he said, his voice calm but urgent. He shined a small light into her eyes, and Emma's limp form twitched slightly. "She's alive, but we need to get her to a quiet place to recover." The judge quickly banged his gavel, calling for order. "We'll recess until further notice," he announced, his voice betraying a hint of unease. The room buzzed with whispers as people tried to make sense of the unsettling turn of events. Sarah and Mike were led out of the courtroom, following the paramedic as Emma was carefully carried to a back room. Sarah stayed close, her face tear-streaked and filled with worry. Mike walked beside her, his face pale with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Neither of them said anything as they entered the room, where Emma was laid down on a cot. "Is she going to be okay?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The paramedic nodded. "She's fine. She just fainted from the stress. We'll keep an eye on her for a while." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She looked at her daughter's pale face, at the teddy bear clutched tightly in her hands, and felt a new wave of panic rise in her chest. What had Emma meant? What did she know about Lucy's disappearance? Why hadn't she said anything sooner? Was she hiding something? The paramedic stepped out of the room, leaving Sarah and Mike alone with their daughter. As they sat in the quiet room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was holding something back. Something important. 3 weeks before Emma's courtroom confession, life in the Miller household had been different. The morning air had smelled of fresh coffee, and the sound of children's laughter had echoed through the house. It was the kind of home where homemade cookies filled the kitchen, and the clatter of soccer cleats hitting the hallway floor was a daily soundtrack. But beneath the cheerful surface, things weren't as idyllic as they seemed. Emma was the youngest of 3 siblings. Her older sister, Lucy, was 10, and her brother, Ethan, was 14. They had lived in their suburban home for as long as Emma could remember. Their family was close-knit, spending most of their evenings together, whether it was sitting down for a family dinner or watching movies in the living room. But recently, the warmth had started to fade. Emma and Lucy shared a room. It wasn't large, but it was cozy enough for 2 sisters, with bunk beds against the wall and a soft nightlight shaped like a star on the shelf. Emma had always loved the light. It was comforting, a reminder of her safety. But Lucy, who had always been the more independent one, hated the nightlight. She had started demanding it be turned off, claiming she was too old for it. "You're such a baby," Lucy would tease Emma. "You should sleep in the dark." Emma clutched her teddy bear tighter, her little voice shaking as she defended herself. "I'm not a baby. I just don't like the dark." Lucy would roll her eyes, a smirk on her face. "Fine, then sleep in the dark. It's not my problem." It was a typical sibling argument, nothing too serious, just a little teasing, until the teasing became more frequent. Lucy started picking on Emma more, ignoring her and dismissing her attempts to connect. And Emma, for the first time in her life, felt a sense of unease around her sister. It wasn't just the nightlight anymore. It was everything. The tension in the house grew when Lucy began to withdraw more. It started slowly. After school, Lucy stopped hanging out with Emma, preferring to stay in their shared room, staring out the window for hours. At the dinner table, she barely spoke. When Emma showed her a drawing she was proud of, Lucy snapped, "Go away, Emma. I'm not in the mood." Emma didn't know what to make of it. Her heart felt heavy every time Lucy snapped at her. She missed the times when they would laugh and play together. Lucy used to help her with homework, braid her hair, and even pick out clothes for her. But now, Lucy didn't even seem to notice her anymore. Emma's own attempts to connect fell flat. One night, after another silent dinner, Emma couldn't take it any longer. She lay in bed, hugging her teddy bear tightly to her chest. She felt the coldness between her and Lucy, and she couldn't understand why it had happened so quickly. She missed her sister, the person she had always turned to, the person she had shared everything with, was gone. Lucy had changed, but Emma couldn't figure out why. The next morning, Lucy seemed slightly better. She even helped Emma tie her shoes before school, offering a faint smile. But by the time they returned home, the distance between them felt insurmountable again. Lucy locked herself in their room, refusing to come out. Emma knocked gently on the door. "Lucy, can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft, unsure. There was no answer. Emma's hand lingered on the doorknob, but she didn't have the courage to push it open. Instead, she went downstairs to find their mother. "Mom, Lucy won't let me in her room again," Emma complained, her voice tinged with frustration. Sarah, their mother, sighed heavily, rubbing her forehead. She was growing concerned. "Lucy," she called, her voice warm but firm. "Open the door. What's going on with you, sweetheart?" At first, there was nothing but silence. Then the door creaked open, just enough for Sarah to see Lucy standing there. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. "I'm fine," Lucy muttered, before quickly disappearing back into her room, the door clicking shut behind her. Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Mike, who had just walked into the room. They didn't know what was going on with their daughter, but they could both feel the tension rising. Over the next few days, Lucy's behavior grew even more erratic. She stopped talking to her friends, refused to eat much, and spent hours staring out the window, lost in thought. Sarah and Mike debated taking her to see a doctor, but Lucy insisted she was fine. She refused to talk to anyone about what was bothering her. That night, after Sarah tucked Emma into bed, the younger girl whispered, "Mom, do you think Lucy's mad at me?" Sarah frowned, brushing Emma's hair back from her face. "Sweetheart, no one's mad at you," she said gently. "Lucy's just going through something right now. It's not your fault, okay?" Emma nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't ease. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew something wasn't right. The family was falling apart in small ways. Ethan, their older brother, retreated into his own world, lost in his video games. He wasn't interested in the family dynamics. and he avoided confronting the growing distance between the siblings. Sarah and Mike, while worried, felt helpless. They didn't know how to help Lucy, and Emma, although she longed for things to be better, couldn't find a way to fix it either. Then came the night that would change everything. It started as a regular Friday evening. The storm clouds had gathered overhead, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Emma had been in bed for an hour, trying to fall asleep despite the noise of thunder and the gusts of wind shaking the windows. She could hear Lucy moving around on the top bunk, the creaking of the bed as her sister shifted restlessly. Emma frowned, glancing up at the top bunk. "Lucy?" she whispered, her voice trembling with unease. But there was no answer. Emma climbed down from her bunk and looked up at her sister. Lucy was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring out the window into the darkness. "Lucy, what's wrong?" Emma asked, her voice quiet, filled with concern. Lucy finally turned to look at her, but her eyes were glassy, her expression blank. "I don't feel good, Emma," she said softly. Emma didn't know what to do. She ran to get their mom, but when she returned, Lucy was gone. The window was wide open, and the rain had begun to pour into the room. "Mom!" Emma shouted, panic rising in her chest. "Lucy's gone!" Sarah rushed upstairs, followed by Mike, as they desperately searched the house, calling Lucy's name. But there was no sign of her anywhere. The storm outside raged on, its fury rattling the windows, as Sarah and Mike Miller searched frantically through the house. The wind howled, and the trees outside bent under the weight of the rain. But in the midst of it all, the house felt like it was closing in on them. Every room was checked, every closet opened, but Lucy was nowhere to be found. "Lucy!" Mike's voice cracked as he called out for her, his face pale with fear. He ran through the house, checking rooms, calling her name again and again, but no answer came. Sarah, her heart racing, tried to stay calm, even as the panic began to take over. She turned to Emma, who was standing by the stairs, her small face pale and stricken with confusion. "Emma, where is she?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with both urgency and concern. I don't know, Mom," Emma said, her voice small, trembling. She wiped her tear-streaked face, her teddy bear still clutched tightly to her chest. "I just went to bed." "I heard her moving around, but when I went to check, she was gone." Mike shot Sarah a look, one of both frustration and helplessness. The storm was too violent to search the yard, and the heavy rain made it nearly impossible for the police to help immediately. Still, Sarah felt the weight of the fear building in her chest. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the knowledge that something was terribly wrong. "Call the police," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she grabbed her phone. Her hands fumbled for a moment, and when she finally managed to dial, she barely heard the dispatcher's voice over the storm. "My daughter's missing," Sarah cried, barely able to keep the tremor from her voice. "She's gone. I don't know where she is. She just disappeared." The dispatcher, though calm, reassured her that officers would be on their way. But as Sarah hung up, she couldn't shake the cold grip of dread that had settled in her heart. Lucy had never just disappeared before. She would have never run away in the middle of a storm. Something was wrong, something much worse than anyone could have imagined. Emma, still clutching her teddy bear, sat down on the couch, her small body trembling as the minutes dragged on. She kept replaying the moment she had heard Lucy's footsteps, the sound of her sister's soft voice saying she didn't feel well. And then Lucy had simply gone. Lucy had been different lately, more withdrawn, more secretive. But Emma didn't know why. She hadn't known that anything was this bad. She thought it was just another one of Lucy's phases. She thought her sister just needed space. But now, with the storm howling outside and no sign of Lucy anywhere, Emma realized how wrong she had been. "I heard her scream," Emma whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else, her voice barely audible over the storm. Sarah's head snapped up as she looked at her daughter, her heart skipping a beat. "What did you say?" Sarah asked, her voice urgent yet gentle. She kneeled beside Emma, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that had been threatening to overwhelm her all night. "I heard her scream," Emma repeated, her voice shaky. "It was loud. Then everything was quiet." Mike, who had been pacing, froze in his tracks. His eyes widened. "You heard Lucy scream? Where? When?" I was still in bed," Emma continued, her voice trembling. "I don't know where she went, but I thought she was just in the room. But then I heard her scream. It sounded like she was in pain." A wave of panic surged through Sarah. She pulled Emma into a tight hug, kissing her forehead. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though she knew deep down that nothing about this situation was okay. "We'll find her. I promise. We'll find her." But even as she said the words, she felt a deep, gnawing fear that told her this wasn't going to end like she hoped. The feeling that something was terribly wrong, that her daughter was in danger, was suffocating. The search continued through the house, with no sign of Lucy. Sarah and Mike checked every possible hiding spot, under the bed, in closets, behind doors, but Lucy wasn't there. The storm kept howling, the lightning flashing outside like an omen of impending doom. The police arrived shortly after, the officers stepping inside the house with determined expressions. They were efficient and calm, immediately beginning their own search of the property. One of the officers approached Mike and Sarah. "We'll need to search the area, check the surrounding streets, and notify the neighbors," the officer said, his voice steady but somber. "But with this storm, it's going to be tough to see anything outside. We'll get started as soon as we can." "I don't understand," Mike said, his voice tight with frustration. "Where could she have gone? She couldn't have just run off into this storm. She wasn't like that. She's never done anything like this before." "I know," Sarah whispered, her face pale as she tried to hold herself together. "But something is wrong. I can feel it. I can feel it in my bones." The police set up a command post outside, and with the rain pouring down in torrents, they began their search, calling Lucy's name into the night. Their voices, along with the sound of their flashlights cutting through the darkness, echoed through the neighborhood. But no answer came. Hours passed. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and still there was no sign of Lucy. Days turned into weeks, and the search continued, though the intensity began to fade as time went on. No leads, no clues. It was as if Lucy had vanished into thin air. But Emma held on to something that no one else knew. She had seen something that night, something she hadn't told anyone, a secret that twisted inside her, gnawing at her conscience, but one she didn't know how to confess. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She hadn't meant to cause any pain. But as the days dragged on, and the search for Lucy grew colder, Emma knew that the truth would have to come out eventually. And when it did, it would change everything. The days that followed Lucy's disappearance were long and filled with an unspoken grief that hung heavy over the Miller household. The storm had passed, but the emotional storm had only just begun. The house, once full of laughter and the sounds of everyday life, now felt eerily quiet. Sarah and Mike did their best to maintain a sense of normalcy for Emma, but it was clear that nothing could return to what it was before. The tension was palpable. The police were still searching, but the leads had grown cold. Lucy's name was plastered on missing persons flyers across town, But still, there was no sign of her. Every day, Sarah and Mike held out hope, though the empty days began to erode that hope bit by bit. For Emma, the guilt was suffocating. She couldn't stop thinking about that night. The storm, the scream, her sister. Why hadn't she done something? Why hadn't she told someone? It wasn't as if Emma had been unaware of the changes in Lucy. She knew something was wrong, but she had never imagined it could lead to this. She had no idea what was really going on in her sister's life. And now, her silence felt like the most unforgivable betrayal. Emma couldn't escape the images in her mind. The storm outside had seemed like the perfect backdrop to her own sense of helplessness. She could still hear Lucy's voice, soft and distant, saying, "I don't feel good." But she hadn't understood what it meant. She should have understood. She should have listened harder. It was 3 days after Lucy's disappearance that Emma found herself sitting on her bed, clutching her teddy bear once more. The familiar comfort of it didn't soothe her anymore, as it had done in the past. She had kept it close ever since that night, as if somehow the bear could shield her from the hurt. But it no longer worked. Her mind raced as she thought about the truth she had hidden for days, the secret she had kept buried deep inside her. She had been so scared to tell anyone, too afraid of what it might mean for her family. But the longer she stayed silent, the heavier the burden became. "Mom," Emma whispered one evening, breaking the long silence in the house. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, glanced over at her daughter. She had been avoiding speaking with Emma about the details of the night Lucy had vanished, knowing the little girl was struggling with her own emotions. But Emma's voice was different this time, soft and broken. "Mom," Emma said again, her voice trembling, "I have to tell you something." Sarah set down the cup of tea she had been holding and moved closer to Emma. "Sweetheart, you can tell me anything," she said, her voice gentle but filled with concern. Emma paused for a long moment, her hands shaking as she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The night Lucy disappeared, I heard her scream." Sarah's heart stopped for a moment as she looked at her daughter, her eyes wide with shock. She had suspected that something had happened, that Emma knew more than she had let on, but hearing her say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. Emma, still clutching her teddy bear, looked at her mother, her eyes filled with tears. "I heard her scream, Mom," Emma repeated, her voice quivering. "And I didn't do anything. I was too scared. I thought she'd come back. I didn't know what to do." Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she hugged Emma tightly, her own heart breaking for the pain that the little girl had been carrying. "Oh, sweetheart, you couldn't have known what was going to happen. You're just a little girl. You did the best you could." But Emma shook her head, her sobs echoing through the room. "I should have done something. I should have told you. I should have stopped her. I should have gone after her. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want her to—" "Shh," Sarah whispered, holding Emma even tighter. "It's not your fault. We don't know what happened yet. And we'll figure it out. Together." But even as Sarah comforted her daughter, a part of her wondered what the truth really was. Emma's confession, though painful to hear, didn't answer all the questions. Why had Lucy screamed? What had happened in the moments before she disappeared? Why hadn't she come back? The guilt that weighed heavily on Emma's small shoulders didn't belong to her alone. Sarah and Mike were struggling with the same question. How had they missed the signs? They had noticed Lucy's mood changes, the way she had withdrawn from the family, but they hadn't acted soon enough. The question of why Lucy hadn't come to them with her problems gnawed at them both. "Mike," Sarah said, her voice quiet but filled with desperation. "Do you think Emma knows something more? Something about Lucy's disappearance? I feel like there's more she's not telling us." Mike, who had been standing at the doorway, stepped into the room and sat beside his wife. His face was etched with exhaustion, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights spent searching and worrying. He reached for Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But we can't push Emma. She's been through so much already. If she knows something more, she'll tell us when she's ready." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't looking in the right places. They had been searching the woods, the streets, even questioned neighbors, but everything had come up empty. And now, with Emma's confession, it felt like they were closer to the truth, but still far away. As the days wore on, the tension in the house became unbearable. Emma kept asking herself, what had she missed? Why hadn't she done something sooner? She wasn't just hiding the scream anymore. She was hiding her fear that she could have done something to stop what had happened to Lucy. But how could a little girl have known what was coming? And somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrifying thought grew. What if Lucy hadn't just run away? What if something worse had happened? What if they were looking for answers in the wrong places? The search for Lucy had now stretched into weeks. Despite the best efforts of the police and the entire community, there had been no sign of her. The constant buzz of unanswered phone calls, the sight of missing person flyers posted on every lamppost, and the increasing sense of dread that hung over the Miller household left a heavy feeling of helplessness in the air. As much as Sarah and Mike tried to remain hopeful, the uncertainty about what had happened to their daughter seemed to consume them more each day. Emma had grown quieter in the weeks since her confession. She spent most of her time in her room, clutching her teddy bear, staring blankly at the wall. She couldn't shake the guilt, nor could she escape the images of the night Lucy disappeared. The scream, the empty room. Her sister was out there, somewhere, and Emma had done nothing to help her. One afternoon, when the rain was beginning to fall again, Emma decided she needed to do something. She couldn't just sit around waiting any longer. She needed to know the truth, needed to find out what had happened to Lucy. Without telling her parents, Emma slipped out of the house. She felt a strange sense of determination surging through her as she walked down the sidewalk and into the woods behind their home. She had been here many times before, during family outings or while playing with Lucy and Ethan. But now, it felt different. The woods seemed darker, more menacing, as if hiding secrets just beyond the trees. Emma wasn't sure where she was headed, but she felt an inexplicable pull. She knew she needed to find something, anything, that could lead her to her sister. The crunch of leaves under her shoes was the only sound she could hear as she moved deeper into the woods, her breath quickening with each step. It wasn't long before she heard something, a rustling sound coming from the bushes ahead. Emma stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. She looked around, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Then, from behind a cluster of bushes, a figure emerged. It was a man, his clothes torn and dirty, his face shadowed by the hood of his jacket. Emma froze, unsure of what to do. Her first instinct was to turn and run, but something about the way the man stood there, still, watching her, made her hesitate. The man looked at Emma with wide, frantic eyes, as if he hadn't expected to see her there. He took a step toward her, his movements jerky. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice hoarse and tense. Emma's pulse quickened. She didn't know what to say, but she had to find out what he knew. "Do you know where my sister is?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Have you seen her?" The man's face twisted in something between fear and anger, and he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, his voice rising. "It's not safe." Emma's grip tightened on her teddy bear, but she didn't step back. "Please," she begged, her voice soft but desperate. "I just want to know where she is. I need to find Lucy." The man hesitated, as if torn between saying something and walking away. "You won't find her out here," he muttered under his breath. "You have to leave now, before it's too late." Emma's mind raced. What was he talking about? Why didn't he want her to find Lucy? Was he hiding something? And why was he so insistent that she leave? "Please," Emma repeated, this time more firmly. "I just need to know the truth. I have to find her." The man's eyes darted nervously around the woods, and for a split second, Emma saw a flicker of fear cross his face. "If you really want to find her," he said slowly, his voice low and reluctant, "you need to follow me." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Was he going to help her? Or was this a trap? He must have sensed her hesitation because he stepped back, throwing his hands up in the air. "Look, I'm not going to hurt you. But you have to be careful. There are people who don't want you to know what's going on out here." A chill ran down Emma's spine. She had no idea what he meant, but she knew this was the closest she had come to finding her sister. She could feel it in her gut. "What's going on out here?" Emma asked, her voice shaking but steady. "Who are you? Why are you acting so strange?" The man seemed to hesitate, as if weighing whether or not to tell her the truth. Then, with a deep sigh, he looked her in the eyes. "They took your sister," he said bluntly, "and I'm trying to stop them." Emma felt like she had been punched in the stomach. Her knees wobbled beneath her, and she had to take a step back to steady herself. "What do you mean? Who took her? Why?" The man ran a hand through his tangled hair, his expression hardening. "There's a group out here. They've been taking kids. Kids no one will miss. Lucy saw something she shouldn't have. Something big. And now, they've got her." The weight of his words crashed over Emma like a tidal wave. Her sister hadn't run away. She hadn't just disappeared. Someone had taken her. And Emma had been too scared to stop it. "You know where they've taken her?" Emma asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man nodded slowly, his face grim. "I know where they keep them. But getting to her isn't going to be easy. And you need to be ready. Because once you get involved with them, there's no turning back." Emma's mind raced, but there was only one thing she knew for certain. She wasn't going to stop until she found Lucy, no matter how dangerous it was. "Take me there," she said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready." The man studied her for a moment, as if he wasn't sure whether she fully understood what she was asking. But then he sighed and nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's go." And just like that, Emma was about to step into a world of darkness and danger. She didn't know what she would find, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to stop searching for Lucy, no matter what it took. Emma followed the man deeper into the woods, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The trees seemed to loom over her, their branches swaying ominously in the wind, casting long shadows across the path. The farther they walked, the darker it seemed to get, and the air felt thicker, heavier, as if it held secrets just out of reach. The man walked ahead of her, his steps quick but careful, as if he knew the woods too well. Emma kept a tight grip on her teddy bear, clutching it for comfort. But she knew this wasn't just a walk through familiar territory. This was something far more dangerous. The man had spoken of people who would do anything to hide the truth. People who took kids. Kids like her sister. Her mind raced. Who were these people? Why had they taken Lucy? And what did the man mean when he said Lucy had seen something she shouldn't have? There were more questions than answers, and the fear clawing at Emma's chest made it hard to focus. But the thought of Lucy, somewhere out there, kept her moving. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't turn back. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the only sound being the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional gust of wind rustling the trees. Emma felt her stomach twist with anxiety, but she pressed on. The man's presence ahead of her was strangely reassuring. He was leading her somewhere. He knew something, and maybe, just maybe, he could help her find her sister. Finally, the man stopped at the base of a tall, narrow hill. He turned to Emma, his face serious. "We're close now," he said, his voice low, as if trying to keep their presence hidden. "But this is where it gets dangerous. You need to stay close, and you need to be quiet. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She was scared, but the thought of what might be happening to Lucy, alone, frightened, was enough to push her forward. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just want to find my sister." The man nodded grimly and turned to face the hill, motioning for Emma to follow. They climbed up the steep incline, the ground slippery and treacherous from the rain. The higher they went, the more Emma felt a sense of unease settle in her stomach. Something was off. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel it, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. At the top of the hill, they reached a clearing. Emma's eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. There, nestled deep in the trees, was an old, decrepit building. It looked like something out of a nightmare, tall, with jagged edges and a darkened, crumbling facade. The windows were boarded up, the door barely hanging on its hinges. There was no sign of life around it, but Emma could feel something, a heaviness, in the air. "This is it," the man said quietly, his voice tinged with something like regret. "This is where they keep them." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Is Lucy here?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and hope. The man nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "If she's still alive, she's here. But we have to be careful. They're always watching, always listening. One wrong move, and we could be caught." Emma's heart raced as she glanced around, her senses on high alert. The trees loomed around the clearing like silent sentinels, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. She wanted to shout for Lucy, to run inside and find her sister. But she knew better. She had to be patient. She had to wait for the right moment. The man motioned for Emma to crouch down beside him behind a thick cluster of bushes, where they could observe the building from a distance. They waited in silence for what felt like hours, Emma's mind racing with worry. What if Lucy was inside, frightened and alone? What if the people who had taken her were waiting for them, ready to stop anyone who tried to uncover their secrets? Finally, the man stood up and motioned for Emma to follow. "This is our chance," he whispered. "I'm going to create a distraction. When I do, you need to run for the building. Stay low. Stay hidden. Do not let anyone see you. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, though her hands were shaking. "I can do it," she whispered, trying to sound braver than she felt. The man looked at her one last time, his eyes softening for a brief moment. "Good," he said. "I'll be right behind you." With that, the man slipped away into the trees, moving silently as he disappeared into the shadows. Emma waited, her heart racing. She had no idea what kind of distraction he was planning, but she didn't have time to think about it. She had to act. She had to find Lucy. The sound of rustling leaves broke the silence. Emma's head snapped to the side, and she saw the man's figure darting toward the far end of the clearing, where a loud crash rang out. Something had been thrown. The distraction was in full swing. Emma wasted no time. She sprang from her hiding spot, her heart pounding as she ran toward the building. She kept her head low, ducking behind trees and bushes as she neared the structure. The closer she got, the more she could hear. Voices from inside, faint but clear, talking in low, hurried tones. The doors were cracked open just slightly, and Emma slipped inside without a second thought. The air inside was thick with dust and musty old wood. It smelled like neglect, like something had been abandoned for years. Emma moved cautiously, her breath shallow as she stepped into the dimly lit hallway. She could hear the voices ahead, but she had no idea where they were coming from. They could be in any of the rooms, hidden in the shadows, just waiting for her to make a mistake. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to make as little noise as possible. Her feet barely made a sound on the creaky wooden floor as she moved forward, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the building. She felt the weight of her fear pressing down on her with every step, but she pushed it aside. She had to keep going. She had to find Lucy. As she reached the end of the hall, she heard something, a faint sobbing sound muffled by the walls. Her heart leapt in her chest. It was her sister. It had to be. Emma stepped forward, moving toward the sound, praying that she was right. She rounded the corner, her eyes wide with hope. And there, in the dim light, she saw her. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat as she stood in the doorway, staring at the figure before her. There, huddled in a corner, was Lucy. Her once bright eyes were dull and filled with exhaustion, her clothes torn and dirty, and her face pale from days, maybe weeks, of fear and confinement. But it was her. It was Lucy. The sobbing Emma had heard wasn't the sound of fear or hopelessness. It was the sound of relief. Relief from a sister who thought she might never be found again. Lucy, Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Her feet moved before she even realized, her heart beating faster with every step. She ran to her sister, her hand reaching out. "Lucy, it's me. It's Emma. I found you." Lucy's head snapped up at the sound of Emma's voice, and for a moment she just stared at her. Her wide, tear-filled eyes were filled with disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend that her sister was standing right in front of her. Then, all at once, the emotions hit Lucy. She leaped up, her arms outstretched, and pulled Emma into a tight hug. I didn't think I'd see you again," Lucy whispered, her voice shaking with relief. "I thought you'd forgotten about me. I thought no one was coming." Emma clung to her sister, her own tears flowing freely now, mixing with Lucy's. The weight of the past weeks, the confusion, and the fear melted away in that moment. She had found Lucy. She wasn't too late. They were together again. But the reunion didn't last long. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere in the building, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Whoever had taken Lucy, whoever had kept her locked away, was still here. And they were close. "Lucy, we need to go. We have to get out of here," Emma said urgently, pulling back from the hug and grabbing her sister's hand. Lucy nodded, her face still pale but filled with a new sense of determination. She had been waiting for this moment, and now that it had come, she wasn't going to let anything stop her. They moved quickly, crouching low and sticking to the shadows. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as they made their way down the hallway. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer. Time was running out. Emma knew they had to get out, but she also knew that escaping wouldn't be easy. Suddenly, a loud voice broke through the tension. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" Emma's blood ran cold. The man, the one who had been watching them earlier, was now standing at the far end of the hallway, blocking their only exit. He looked furious, his eyes dark with anger. "You shouldn't have come here," he snarled. "You shouldn't have found her. Now you'll pay the price." Lucy froze, pulling Emma behind her. "Who are you?" Lucy demanded, her voice shaky but fierce. "What do you want with us?" The man took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "You think you can just waltz in here and take her?" he spat. "You're too late. You don't understand what's at stake." Emma's mind raced. She had no idea who this man was, or why he was so angry, but she could feel the danger in the air. Her heart was beating in her ears as she tried to think of a way out. The man was blocking the only escape route, and they couldn't stay here. They needed help. "Lucy," Emma whispered urgently, "we have to run. Now." Without another word, Emma yanked Lucy's hand, pulling her toward the side of the room where a door stood slightly ajar. The man shouted, his voice laced with fury as he rushed toward them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Emma's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't let them catch her. She couldn't let them take Lucy again. They reached the door, and just as Emma pulled it open, a shout rang out behind them. "You can't escape! It's too late!" The door swung open with a creak, and the two girls rushed through it, tumbling into the darkness outside. The night air hit them like a slap, cold and sharp. The woods seemed different now, more threatening, more alive. But they had no choice. They had to keep running. The sounds of pursuit were close behind them. The man had followed them, and Emma could hear his footsteps crashing through the underbrush. But she didn't dare look back. She couldn't. She just had to keep moving. "Where do we go?" Lucy gasped, her breath heavy and panicked. Her legs were tiring, but she didn't want to stop. "We need to get to the road," Emma said, glancing over her shoulder. She could just make out the silhouette of the man in the distance, but they were gaining ground. They had to make it to safety. The man's voice rang out from behind them, cutting through the darkness. "You'll regret this. You think you can just walk away from us? We control everything. You won't get away." Emma's stomach twisted with fear, but she didn't stop. The road was just ahead. She could see the faint glow of streetlights cutting through the trees. "We're almost there," Emma urged, her legs aching, but the thought of safety kept her going. Lucy's hand tightened in hers as they pushed forward, their footsteps thudding in unison against the damp earth. Finally, they broke through the last line of trees, and Emma saw the road. The streetlights flickered ahead, and in the distance, the silhouette of a car could be seen, parked at the side. The headlights were off, but someone was waiting for them. With one final burst of speed, Emma and Lucy ran toward the car, and as they reached it, the door swung open. The man who had been following them stopped at the edge of the trees, his breath ragged as he stood there, glaring. "Get in, now!" a voice called from inside the car. Emma didn't hesitate. She yanked the door open and climbed inside, pulling Lucy with her. The engine roared to life just as the man stepped forward. But before he could take another step, the car peeled out, speeding down the road and away from the danger behind them. Emma and Lucy collapsed into the back seat, their chests heaving with exhaustion. They were safe. For now. "Thank you," Emma whispered, looking at the driver. He was the man who had been helping them, the one who had been guiding them through the woods. "You're welcome," he said, glancing back at them. "But we're not out of danger yet. This is just the beginning." Emma nodded, still trying to catch her breath. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. she wasn't giving up. She would find Lucy, no matter what, and together they would uncover the truth. The car sped down the road, the engine roaring as it cut through the darkness. Emma sat up, her head spinning from the adrenaline of their escape. The cold night air rushed through the cracked window, but she hardly noticed it. All she could think about was what lay ahead. They were out of immediate danger, but Emma knew they hadn't escaped yet. Not completely. Lucy was sitting beside her, her face pale but filled with a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Emma squeezed her sister's hand, offering a comforting smile, but it didn't ease the worry gnawing at her insides. They had made it out of the woods, but the man, the one who had taken them there, the one who had been helping them, was right. They weren't safe yet. "Where are we going?" Lucy asked softly, her voice weak from everything that had happened. She looked at Emma, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and fear. "What's going on? Who are those people? Why did they take me?" Emma didn't know how to answer her sister's questions. She had so many of her own, and she wasn't sure who to trust anymore. All she knew was that they had to keep moving, keep running until they were far enough away to find answers. "I don't know," Emma said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But we have to stay together. We'll figure it out. I promise." The man driving the car, whose name Emma still didn't know, glanced at them in the rearview mirror. He had an intense look on his face, his eyes focused on the road, but there was a weariness in his gaze. He didn't seem surprised by their questions, as if he'd been through this kind of situation before. But there was something else in his eyes, something darker. He knew more than he was letting on, and Emma could tell he wasn't about to tell them everything. Not yet. "We're going to a safe house," the man said quietly, his voice low but steady. "It's the only place you'll be safe for now." Emma and Lucy exchanged a look. A safe house? Who was this man? And what did he mean by that? The uncertainty of it all made Emma's chest tighten. She had trusted him, but now the questions started to pile up faster than she could answer them. The car turned off the main road, veering down a winding, narrow path that seemed to lead into the heart of the woods again. Emma's pulse quickened, and her grip on Lucy's hand tightened. This wasn't where she thought they were going. She had expected a house in the city, a place where they could hide, but this road seemed to be taking them farther into isolation, into more danger. "We can't go back there," Emma whispered, her voice tight with fear. "I know," the man said, his eyes flickering toward the rearview mirror. "This isn't where we're staying. I'm just making sure we're not followed." Emma didn't know if she believed him. The roads were empty, and the woods seemed quiet. But there was something unsettling about the way the man spoke, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. She looked out the window, the trees passing by in a blur, the dark shapes of the branches reaching out like fingers in the night. After what felt like an eternity, the man slowed the car and turned onto a dirt driveway hidden behind a thick wall of trees. The headlights flickered over the area, revealing a small, isolated cabin tucked away in the woods. It was barely visible from the road, and the surrounding trees seemed to shield it from view. There was no sign of life, no lights, no movement. He parked the car in front of the cabin and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. Emma felt the weight of it in her chest, the realization that they had just entered a place they didn't know. The man didn't look at them, but the tension in the air was thick with unspoken words. "We'll be safe here for now," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma's unease only deepened. "Why don't I trust you?" Emma muttered under her breath, but Lucy heard her. "Emma, what's going on? Who is he?" Where are we? I don't know, Lucy, Emma replied, her voice low. I just know we can't stay here long. We have to keep moving. We need to find out who took you, and why. The man opened the door and stepped out of the car, walking briskly toward the cabin. Emma hesitated before following. She had to trust him, for now. She couldn't afford to let fear control her, but she wouldn't let her guard down. Not yet. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was sterile and cold. Unlike the warm, welcoming homes Emma had always known, there were no pictures on the walls, no personal touches that made it feel like a home. The furniture was sparse and functional, just the basics, as if the place was meant for one purpose: to hide. The man moved toward the small kitchen area and opened a cabinet. I'll make sure you're settled in, he said curtly, though his tone lacked warmth. He didn't offer them a seat or any hospitality. Instead, he turned back toward them with a hard look on his face. You won't be safe here for long. We've got to move soon, and you're not safe yet. Emma's heart sank. This was not the safety she had imagined. But what choice did they have? If they stayed out there, they would be vulnerable. The danger was still out there, following them. Who are you? Emma asked, her voice steady despite the questions swirling in her mind. Why are you helping us? The man paused, looking at Emma as if debating whether to answer. Finally he spoke, his voice flat and serious. You don't need to know who I am. What matters is that I'm on your side. I'm trying to stop what's going on out here, and I'm trying to make sure no one else gets hurt. I don't understand, Lucy said, her voice filled with confusion. Why are people taking kids? What do they want from us? I don't know everything, the man admitted, his expression grim. But I know enough, and that's why I'm here. I've seen what they're capable of. Emma and Lucy exchanged a look. The man was hiding something. He knew more than he was letting on, but he wasn't about to share it with them. Not yet, anyway. Emma swallowed her fear. They couldn't wait any longer. She needed to find the truth. She needed to get answers, not just for herself, but for Lucy. I'm going to find out what's going on, Emma whispered to herself, her resolve hardening. I'm not going to stop until I get the truth. The hours that followed felt like a blur. Emma and Lucy sat on the worn couch in the cabin, their eyes scanning the small room, unable to shake the tension in the air. The man who had brought them here had left to make some calls, but neither Emma nor Lucy spoke much during his absence. They were too consumed by the swirling confusion of what had happened, and what was still happening. The cabin, though seemingly safe, felt like a cage. Emma kept looking at the windows, wondering if someone dangerous, was watching them. The thought of the man they had encountered in the woods haunted her mind, the way he had threatened them, his voice dripping with anger. But it wasn't just him. It was everything. The strange words the man in the car had spoken, the vague warnings, and then there was the question that weighed most heavily on Emma's heart. Who had taken Lucy, and why? Why had her sister been taken in the first place? What had she seen that was so important? Emma couldn't help but feel the need for answers growing stronger with each passing minute. She couldn't sit idly by, not when Lucy's safety was on the line, not when she had no idea what dangers still lurked in the shadows. I'm going to find out what's going on, Emma muttered to herself, her jaw set in determination. Lucy, who had been staring out the window, looked up at her sister with a mixture of curiosity and concern. What do you mean? Lucy asked, her voice soft. What are you going to do? Emma stood up, her heart beating faster with each step she took toward the door. I need to find the answers, she said. I can't wait any longer. I need to know who's behind this, why they took you. Lucy looked at her sister, her face filled with a quiet fear. "Be careful, Emma. We don't know who we can trust anymore. What if they're still looking for us?" Emma turned to her sister, her expression resolute. "I have to do this, Lucy. We don't have a choice." Before Lucy could say anything else, Emma slipped out the door, her mind made up. She had no idea where to begin, but she couldn't just sit here, waiting for the next move. She needed to take control. She needed to find out what was really happening. The cold night air hit her as she stepped into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around her, their dark branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands. She could barely see, but the familiar sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, somehow comforted her. The night was her only companion, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of purpose. She walked for what felt like hours, though the trees were eerily quiet around her, as if they were holding their breath. The man who had helped them had warned her about being followed, but Emma hadn't seen any signs of pursuit. Still, she knew the woods could be deceptive. She had to move quickly, stay alert, and trust her instincts. She had to find something that would give her answers. Eventually, Emma came across a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting faint, ghostly shadows across the ground. At first, she thought it was just another ordinary part of the woods, but then her gaze fell upon something that stopped her dead in her tracks. There, half hidden behind a large boulder, was a small, abandoned structure. It looked like a shack, run down and neglected, but something about it made Emma's pulse quicken. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to it. The urge to find out what lay inside was overpowering. Taking a deep breath, Emma crept toward the shack. Her steps were light, barely making a sound as she approached the rickety wooden door. It was cracked open just enough for her to slip through. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was a trap, but then her curiosity won out. She pushed the door open slightly and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled damp and stale, and Emma's eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. There was a sense of decay in the air, and as she scanned the room, her heart began to race. The shack was filled with old furniture, mostly broken and covered in dust. But it was the walls that caught Emma's attention. The walls were lined with photographs, pinned haphazardly to the wooden beams. Some of them were faded and yellowed with age, but others were relatively new. And in the center of the room, there was a desk, papers scattered across it, some of them marked with strange symbols. Emma walked toward the desk, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew she shouldn't be here, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to understand. As she reached the desk, her eyes fell on one of the photos. It was a picture of a young girl, not much older than Emma herself. She was smiling, her face innocent and carefree. But when Emma looked closer, her blood ran cold. The girl in the picture was holding a small, familiar charm bracelet, one that Emma recognized. It was Lucy's. Emma felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The room began to spin as she stumbled backward, her hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. Her mind raced. What was going on here? Why was Lucy's bracelet in this picture? Who was this girl? Before she could process any more, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the shack. Her heart skipped a beat as she quickly turned and hid behind a stack of old crates. She held her breath, praying that whoever was out there wouldn't notice her. Through the cracks in the shack's walls, Emma saw a figure approaching. The man. The one who had been following them in the woods. He was walking toward the shack, his face shadowed by the hood of his jacket. He stopped just outside the door, his eyes scanning the area. Emma's heart raced in her chest, as she crouched lower, holding her breath. She had to get out of here. This was too dangerous. But as she turned to make her escape, her foot caught on a loose floorboard, sending a loud creak through the shack. The man's head snapped toward the noise, and Emma knew she had been spotted. Emma's heart slammed against her chest as she stood frozen behind the crates. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and she could feel the man's presence just outside the shack, his eyes searching the shadows for any sign of movement. She had been careless, too eager, and now she was trapped. Her mind raced. She had to find a way out. There was no time to think about what she had just seen. The photo, Lucy's bracelet, the strange symbols. Everything was beginning to make sense in a terrifying way. But she couldn't afford to linger. Not now. Her breathing shallow, Emma crouched low, her hands shaking as she prepared to make a run for it. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew she had no choice. If she stayed here, she would be caught. And if that happened, Lucy's life, and possibly her own, would be at risk. Taking a deep breath, Emma burst from behind the crates, sprinting toward the door. She could hear the man's voice call out behind her, "Stop! You can't get away." But Emma didn't stop. Her legs moved faster, her adrenaline kicking in. She pushed herself through the door, darting into the woods, the night air stinging her skin as she ran. Her heart hammered in her chest, her feet slipping on the wet ground as she fled through the trees. The shack behind her was now a distant memory, but the man was close behind. Emma's thoughts were a blur. She wasn't thinking about what had just happened inside the shack, what she had uncovered. The only thing on her mind now was escaping, getting back to Lucy, getting out of the woods. The danger was real, and it was closing in. Suddenly, she heard a shout, followed by a crash from behind. She risked a quick glance over her shoulder and saw the man stumbling, tripping over the uneven terrain. He wasn't as fast as Emma, but he was relentless, and she knew that if he caught her, there would be no turning back. The fear that gripped her chest was replaced with pure determination. She wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let Lucy down. Ahead, Emma spotted a break in the trees, a small clearing that led to a dirt road. The road. It was her only hope. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain in her legs, ignoring the darkness of the woods around her. She had to make it. Just as she reached the clearing, Emma heard the man's voice growl from behind, "You can't outrun me. You're only making it worse for yourself." Emma's blood ran cold, but she didn't slow down. She could see headlights now, bright, flashing through the trees. She could hear a car approaching, and then, in the distance, she saw it, the familiar shape of a vehicle. Her heart leapt. "Emma!" Lucy's voice called out from the car. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she saw her sister, standing by the open door, looking frantically toward her. Without a second thought, Emma dashed toward the car, throwing herself into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life as the driver slammed on the gas, and they sped away from the woods. The man's voice faded behind them, but the terror in Emma's chest didn't immediately fade. It wasn't until they were a good distance away that she allowed herself to breathe, her whole body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Lucy turned to her sister, her face a mixture of worry and relief. "What happened? What did you find? What's going on?" Emma closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the engine calm her racing heart. "I found something, Lucy," she said softly, her voice almost too tired to speak. "I found the truth." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small photo from the shack. She handed it to Lucy, and her sister's eyes widened as she looked at it. The photo of the girl with the charm bracelet, the same one Emma had seen inside the shack. That's "That's my bracelet," Lucy whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "But how did they get it? Who is this girl?" Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't know who she is, but I know why they took you. It wasn't random. You saw something. You were looking at something you weren't supposed to see." Lucy's face paled as she looked at her sister. "What do you mean? What did I see?" Emma shook her head, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place, but the full picture still eluding her. "I don't know all the details, but whatever it was, they couldn't let you go. They couldn't let anyone find out." The man in the woods had been just a small part of something much larger. They were in the middle of something dangerous, something far more complex than Emma could have imagined. And the longer she stayed silent, the more she realized that this wasn't just about Lucy anymore. It was about something far bigger, something that had been happening right under everyone's noses. "I'll never understand why they targeted me," Lucy said, her voice quiet, but full of the same determination Emma had seen before. "But I know I'm not the only one." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "We're not done. This isn't over. They think they can hide the truth, but we won't stop until we find out everything. For you, for all the kids they've taken." As the car sped toward the horizon, Emma held onto the photo tightly, the truth just within reach. They weren't safe yet. There was more to uncover. But together, Emma and Lucy knew one thing for certain. They would never stop fighting, no matter what it took. The road ahead was uncertain, but they were no longer running from it. They were running toward it, toward the truth.